Welcome for joining us for the Archaeology of Connecticut. I'm Glenda Rose, President of Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, along with state archaeologist Dr. Sarah Sportman, co-host Scott Brady, and our special guest. Today's program features a piece of U.S. history that took place here in Connecticut at what is now Putnam Memorial Park, Connecticut's oldest public park. Talk about history under your feet. I discovered this park several years ago when my hiking club led a hike there. I was fascinated to see where soldiers had built a winter encampment there during the Revolutionary War. So I can't wait to hear more about the archaeology of the site. I also encourage you to visit the park and check out the museum and the impressive statue of General Israel Putnam on horseback. So now here's Sarah to introduce our guest.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this month's episode of the Archaeology of Connecticut. We're here this evening with Ellery Leery from the Friends and Neighbors of Putnam Memorial State Park, a nonprofit group whose mission is to help maintain and promote the historical, educational, and recreational values of Putnam Memorial State Park. And this evening we're going to talk about the history of the park. We're going to talk a little bit about the Friends group that Ellery is a part of, and we're going to talk about the history of the archaeology at the park, which has been actually ongoing for decades and decades, and there's a lot of really interesting information that's come out of it. So just to get started, I want to welcome you, Ellery, to the show, and ask you to just, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved with the park.
Sure. Well, hello. Thanks for having me. So my name is Ellery Thomas Leery, and I am from Connecticut. I'm from Stratford. And I got started in archaeology at Norwalk Community College, actually, with Ernie Wiegand. So I took an archaeology class kind of on a whim, really fell in love with it. So I got my bachelor's in history at University of St. Joseph, and then went on to get a master's in archaeology at University College London. I've been working in museums since 2012, starting with an internship at St. Joseph's Art Museum. And when I came back to the States from my archaeology master's, I started working at a Revolutionary War historic site, a different one, Lake Champlain Maritime Museum in Vergennes, Vermont. Extremely cool site that commemorates the Battle of Valcour Island, another Benedict Arnold battle. Extremely interesting. Highly recommend the museum if you haven't been, although it may be closed for this season right now. I also worked at the E.L. Peabody Museum and currently work at the Institute for American Indian Studies. And I worked at Putnam Park from 2018 to 2023 and became involved with the Friends and Neighbors group in 2018 when I started working there, and have now moved on to being the president of the Friends and Neighbors group and have retired from state service due to that.
Due to your involvement with the Friends group?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you for that. I love the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum and everything about that area, so
nice.
It's a good plug for that. Can we talk a little bit about the park itself? I mean, so there's so many things to talk about here. There's the history of the park, the Revolutionary War history of that land that comprises the park, but then there's also just the really interesting history of the park and how the park was developed and how interest kind of in preserving that Revolutionary War history related to the formation of the park that we know today. And I just, I hope we have time to talk about all of these things. But maybe you could just start a little bit with some of the Revolutionary War history of the park that kind of gives it its historical significance.
Sure. So as far as we know, the earliest time the park was ever used was about 4,500 years ago. We know that because we found one projectile point. That's about it. It seems like the site was not really used for much, which makes sense to me. There's not great fishing or farming there, so it wouldn't have been super useful for the local tribes. It was, I believe, purchased by John Reed at some point, not really used until the soldiers arrived in 1778 to 9. The reason they were there, about 3,000 soldiers marched into Reading that winter. They were there because of the British Army's location in and around New York at the time. So instead of all camping in one place like they had the year prior at Valley Forge, the Continental Army was split into three groups. Some stayed in New York, others stayed in Reading, Connecticut. So about 3,000 soldiers went to Reading and spread into three different encampments. Putnam Parks is probably the best preserved, just because, again, the site wasn't used for very much after the soldiers left. When they arrived, we know that, unlike most of Connecticut, which had been more or less clear-cut by that point in the Revolutionary War due to farming and other wood uses, the valley was very closely crowded with trees, so it was an ideal spot to set up and start building huts. You could also see to Long Island Sound, it's said, from there, which really gives you a sense of the scale of deforestation at that point. I think most people in Reading today cannot imagine being able to see Long Island Sound from there at all. So
definitely not.
Putnam, yeah, I know it's hard to imagine. So Israel Putnam came in with a number of units. Connecticut units were at the other two Reading encampments, and what is now the park had the New Hampshire brigades, the 1st and 2nd Brigade, and the Canadian Volunteer Regiment. That's a really interesting regiment that there's been a recent book out about them called Congress's Own by, I can't remember her name, Holly Mayer, I think. Anyway, really interesting. Not a lot of people know that there was a Canadian regiment who joined the Continental cause during the Revolutionary War. They sort of became the first French Foreign Legion, so a very interesting group. At the park, they immediately set about building huts. We know a fair amount about how they were building their huts because we have the instructions. Baron von Steuben, the year before at Valley Forge, had sort of set out a manual for how an army should behave based on his own military experience in Europe. So one of the instructions laid out in his blue book was how to set up a winter encampment. So they were given orders based on that, and so we know that they were mostly building log huts without the use of nails. Everything was dovetailed, joined so that they could build it without iron nails. The chinks in the logs were sort of plastered with mud, and they had rough shingles on many of the roofs. They also had fireplaces made out of stone, and it's those stone fireplaces that you can still see at Putnam Park today, laid out in roughly the arrangement they were when the soldiers left in May of 1779.
Ellery, I've been out, I've been out there, and it's just such a bony, area with big glacial and bedrock. Do they talk at all, or is there any kind of history of how they dealt with that? I can't imagine it was easy building in that type of environment.
Yeah, exactly. So, part of the rocks in some way were useful for building the fireplaces. So, they had no lack of fieldstone with which to do that. However, there are a lot of, really significant glacial erratics around there, including a glacial cave, Phillips Cave, that has been the source of many a local legend. I know that there were differences in how different regiments dealt with that kind of challenge in the landscape. So in the historical archaeology of Washington's Revolutionary War winter encampments, the book edited by Claus Scarletta and a few others, they wrote about how the Canadian regiment, for instance, tended to just sort of work around large rocks in building their huts. They would sort of just build around that and not bother moving them, which may explain why we know from some journals for instance, Dearborn's journal. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Dearborn was the highest ranking officer on site at the time. Higher ranking officers than him got to live in, nice little houses in town. Yeah. So Dearborn in his diary wrote that they were finished building the huts before New Year's, or even before Christmas, perhaps. And I wonder if that was because they did not bother landscaping much. We know that some of the other regiments, the Connecticut regiments, were not necessarily finished building their huts at that time based on Joseph Plum Martin's recollections of it.
Yeah, and so they had a really rough time of it that winter, right? Because looking at some of the journal accounts from that time period, it seemed like December was just storm after storm, rain and snow and kind of miserable conditions.
Yes, I believe it was snowing when they entered camp on the first weekend of December in 1778. And until they finished building their own huts. And of course, the men had to build their officers' huts first before setting about building their own. They had to live in tents. Yes, it really does. They also had much nicer accommodations. Now, the huts were definitely an upgrade from when they were building them and they were living in, small tents, often one mess, which was 4 to 6 men, would be crammed into one small tent together, which, warm and cozy, I guess, but still not ideal winter conditions. So the huts were an upgrade from that, but the huts, the enlisted men's huts, were 12 by 16, 12 feet by 16 feet, with a little fireplace on one side opposite the door. They had triple-decker bunk beds, so they were kind of stacked like cordwood. They would stack 10 to 12 people in each one of those huts. Extremely cozy. Officers, meanwhile, had slightly larger huts. They had slightly nicer roofs. They were made with boards rather than like rough shingles, and sometimes even had wooden floors. They typically had 2 to 4 people in each officer's hut. We know that Lieutenant Colonel Henry Dearborn, highest ranking on site, had his cabin to himself and his valet. His cabin was divided into 2 rooms, so he had a bit of privacy. His side of the cabin had wooden floors. His valet had dirt floors. And he even had enough food to be able to keep a small dog.
That must have gone over really well, because it seems like all the accounts suggest that everybody was pretty miserable and there was very poor food supplies.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I found interesting reading Dave Poirier's research was that it seems that they were getting poorer cuts of meat than people had at Valley Forge. So the nutritional deficiencies were even more significant at Putnam Memorial State Park than Valley Forge, although far fewer people died, probably down to the slightly better living conditions, hutting arrangements, and the not having a smallpox epidemic definitely seems to have helped. I will say a note about Dearborn's dog. If you've read any of Henry Dearborn's diary, which I do recommend, it is kind of funny in some parts. He was involved in the march up to Canada, the disastrous one, with General Montgomery and Benedict Arnold, part of the failed assault on Quebec City. And in the absolutely grueling march, Maine swamps up to Canada, he did have a dog with him, possibly a Newfoundland, definitely a bigger pup. He unfortunately fell ill with a fever at that time during the march. And when he woke up, he later noted that they had ate his dog. So I know. I found it really interesting that he had a dog again at Putnam Park, but possibly went for a smaller one to, make it less appetizing. Unclear.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. You don't read about too much about dogs getting eaten, so that's a different story.
Yeah, it's a little dark, but I think it's kind of a bittersweet anecdote because he did have a dog again, which is nice.
Determined, I guess.
Yeah. We also know at one point he had to eat a rattlesnake. Wasn't happy about that. He was like, it was bad. It didn't taste good. So
I heard it tastes like chicken, but maybe not.
Not to this guy. Who knows? He definitely has an interesting compendium of complaints. Sometimes he'll be like, today I ate a rattlesnake. And the next day he will be like, we were obliged to walk 4 miles to find a level place to play ball. And I'm like, okay, well, it's your diary, I guess.
That just doesn't sound like a military, you know what I mean? Of all the issues you're dealing with, walking 4 miles to play ball doesn't seem like it would be too high on your complaint list. But,
I know. He probably didn't think it would be published, to be fair.
That's true.
Right.
Yeah.
He's probably just venting to himself. But I think that, it's kind of interesting. I wonder if that had something to do with trying to raise morale or something, because everything I've read suggests that there were, people deserting and near riots for the horrible want of food and clothing. And I guess money as well, right? Because their wages were either not coming through and the currency had been devalued and everyone was really miserable about the whole state of affairs.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there were a few attempted mutinies during that winter, mostly among the Connecticut men. The New Hampshire and Canadians were not as miserable, perhaps being more accustomed to worse winters. But we know that a lot of them did not have shoes. There's a letter to Jonathan Trumbull from Nathaniel Webb where he talks about how they don't have, a lot of the times they don't have pants. They're supposed to be given one blanket a year by the Army and another blanket by the state, but some of them, only have one. Some of them, if they've got socks, they don't have shoes. If they've got a shirt, they don't have breeches, that whole kind of thing. So very improperly attired during that very cold winter, in addition to the lack of food. Supplies were very hard to come by, especially after the attack on Danbury the year before. Part of the reason the camp was established where it was in response to the Battle of Ridgefield, Tryon's raid on Danbury in April 1777. And it would have been really disastrous for the Continental Army if there had been another attack like that. So in order to protect Long Island Sound and Danbury and provide support to the Hudson Highlands, that's why the camps in Reading were situated where they were, because they're sort of at the junction of the Norwalk to Danbury, Fairfield to Danbury, and Reading to Point's west roads.
So they get through this winter without too many casualties, and then in the spring they move on. So what happens to the property after that?
Yes, I'll. Should I say more about the mutinies, because there is an interesting story there.
Oh yeah, do that, because mutinies are always very interesting.
Yeah. So the men were, quite displeased. They were planning around New Year's Day to march up to Hartford, where the government was in session, and demand their pay. And depending on who you ask, the mutiny was put down either by a very stirring and eloquent speech from General Putnam or an extra ration of rum. So unclear, maybe a bit of both. And of course, one of the other notable events that takes place that winter is the executions. They are sort of immortalized in the historical fiction book My Brother Sam is Dead, which has been traumatizing Connecticut children for many years now.
Forever.
Yeah, I read it when I was 10, and I've really been on a tear trying to raise the age range. I think it's like a little much for a 10-year-old. So I think they don't assign it to fifth graders anymore. They tend to wait until middle school, which I think is a good idea. But there are some grisly executions that winter. You mentioned people deserting, which was a huge problem. And on one level, there's some kinds of desertion that are not so bad. People just sort of, it not being a very formal army structure, people are like, I'm going to go see my wife. I'll be back in, 3 weeks or whatever. So that's technically considered desertion, but they're coming back. It's not a big deal. But then there's desertion going to the enemy, and that had to be quite severely punished. So in order to quell any more thoughts of mutiny or desertion in February, Putnam, just to make an example of two people who had been captured. One was said to be a spy. The other was said to be a deserter. The deserter was quite young, I believe, like late teens. And they were executed publicly on what is now Gallows Hill Road, which gives you a sense of why it was named that. And men from all three encampments had to be present. The spy was hanged, and the deserter was shot, but at so close a range that his coat caught on fire. And all of the soldiers were forced to march past the bodies, which was, extremely grisly. But in fact, there were not any more attempted mutinies after that. So it worked, I guess.
Yeah, pretty harsh, huh?
Yeah, pretty harsh. I did try to find out why deserters have traditionally been shot. I cannot find out why that is. If anyone has a sense, I did ask someone who was studying military discipline and desertion in the Revolutionary War, and they did not have an answer for me, unfortunately. So if anyone knows, please get in touch. After the soldiers left, they didn't leave all at once. So some marched out to the New London area, patrolling the coast. Others started leaving in March, April, the very last left in May. When they left, I have read, although haven't yet verified, that there was a deal with the local landowner, who was John Reed Jr., son of the founder of Reading. There was a deal with that landowner that when they left, in exchange for them using his land, he could take all of the lumber. So sort of rather than, falling apart or being burned down or what have you, the huts were all pretty swiftly disassembled and lumber reused in construction or for firewood or what have you. That's the best we can figure out what happened to the huts themselves. And aside from that, aside from one ill-fated attempt at farming, there's a clear space where you can't see any of the fireplaces, and that's where people tried to farm for a little bit and quickly realized that it was not worth their time. Aside from that, the land doesn't seem to be used for much of anything until some local landowners began to be interested in preserving the history. It was known locally as the site where the soldiers were, and there are stories of people going and visiting it and looking at it and being like, wow, soldiers were here. But it doesn't really... The first time people expressed an interest in preserving it was in the 1860s, I believe. So a local landowner, Aaron Treadwell, started buying up the property. There was a local historian, Charles Bertaud, descendant of Aaron Burr. That's supposedly how he got interested in genealogy and history generally. They sort of led a charge to turn this place into a military memorial. So there's a couple of reasons why in the 1860s and 70s people are interested in doing this. One is the Civil War. There's sort of a huge crisis of national identity, and people are sort of turning back to the Revolutionary War and looking to sort of redefine their national origin. There's also, of course, the upcoming centennial. In the 1860s, the 100-year anniversary is not too far off. So I think a lot of our folklore about the revolution comes from around that time. People passing down things that their grandparents told them. That's how we get, stories about Betsy Ross and so forth. So people, began interested in memorializing this site. And so through working with other landowners, eventually they managed to create one large parcel of land, which they sold to the state for $1. Now, oftentimes when they learn that, people are like, wow, inflation is crazy. And I'm like, no, it was a symbolic amount, I promise. So it was sold to the state. It was officially established as a park in 1887. So it is the oldest state-run park in Connecticut. Now, Sherwood Island gets to say they're the first state park, technically true, but that's just because Putnam Park predated the state park system. So it had its own separate commission. I believe it was called the Putnam Memorial Camp Commission, something along those lines. And it ran through that separate commission until it was eventually folded into the State Parks Division about 60 or 70 years later.
So they established it at a state park. When does it start to draw people? Is it kind of an immediate thing, or does it take time for it to be upgraded in facilities before people really start to visit it?
So, great question. There is a bit of a lag in between when they officially establish it and when it really takes the shape that we know today. But actually not that long. The obelisk goes up a year later, goes up in 1888. Gorgeous thing, made out of local stone. Obelisks were just really all the rage at the time, so you had to have one. The Washington Monument was not very old by that point. Cleopatra's Needle had recently been stolen from Egypt, so, just obelisks, truly all the rage. And it is a pretty nice one, I must say. One of the quotes on it, "The world stands astonished at their deeds," is taken from the speech that Putnam supposedly gave to quell the mutiny in late 1778. The ground was landscaped. Sorry, go ahead.
No, continue. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. So I was going to say the ground was landscaped to some extent in the late 1880s. I think they tried to sort of respect the site of the encampment to some extent. So they didn't move the stones too much. There's definitely like a bit of disturbance going on around them. And maybe they are like neatening up some of the piles of stones, things of that nature. But for the most part, things are not moved too much right in that site. Of course, around that, all bets are off. They create the road called Company Street, sort of alongside the firebacks. They create this mile-long loop around the park. And again, they're trying to avoid the most historically, archaeologically significant places. But there is, I think most archaeologists today wish they had done less, perhaps, because it has been pretty extensively disturbed in many spots. So they landscaped it. They created some ponds, including the pond across the street, Putnam Pond, the other side of Route 58, Lake McDougal, not really a lake, just a very small pond. Did, some typical late 19th century landscape architecture stuff. And there's a really interesting 1893 guidebook, actually. You can read online. It's hosted by the Library of Congress. There's a version of it you can read. And the park historian at the time, Charles Berthoud, sort of takes you on a walk through the park and what he knows about it. So, at that point, the pavilion had just been built. That is what is now the visitor center. It was originally built as an open-air picnic pavilion. And it was refurbished in 2004, 2005 to be the modern visitor center that it is now. So in terms of visitorship, it did seem to be relatively popular from early on. I mean, I've seen pictures from 1902, thereabouts, yeah. Or even the later 1890s with, cars visiting, a decent amount of people. The most interest you see in the park, though, historically, is around wartime. So there are huge events at the park following World War I. You see just a massive spike in visitorship around that time. Again, around and after World War II. The funding really waxes and wanes with whether or not the U.S. is at war. And so, for example, the huge effort to get the visitor center refurbished was at during the Iraq War, for instance, like right at the beginning of that. Just an interesting pattern I have noticed over the years, looking at historical photos and looking at our visitor logs. We do have visitor logs that go back to 1893, so we have a decent idea.
One of the things I've often wondered about, so at the entrance you have, I guess, what you would call 2 guard towers. Are those based on anything historical, or is that just a kind of a modern recreation of what people, fantasized or expected would have been there in that time period?
Yes. The blockhouses, as they're called. So those are based off a couple things. They're based off of some 7 Years' War / French and Indian War structures that some of the park architects saw in visiting, I want to say, Ohio, somewhere west. And also, interestingly, I don't know if this was intentional on the part of the people building the park. They do also have a resemblance to some structures that the Canadian Regiment went on to build. So the Canadian Regiment sort of went up through Maine and sort of ended up cutting paths through a lot of the Maine wilderness and creating these small, square, blockhouses, very similar, although a little bigger than the ones you see at the gates. So I don't know if that was intentional, but that was one of the things that Dan Cruson learned, that, following the path of the units who left, they did end up building things like that.
I guess maybe one of the things that's interesting about it is that it has almost this reconstruction of all these structures. It seemed like they tried to do them right kind of in the locations of where they were originally built, and in this kind of possibly idealistic way. But it's almost got, by modern conceptions, almost like a Disney World kind of aspect to it, or like a living history museum kind of aspect, which I find really interesting. And I just wonder, do you know how common that is at this time?
Let's see. That is a good question. I'm not totally sure. I couldn't tell you how many places were being treated like that, because a lot of places you would have more, like a solemn monument. You would not have so much the historical reconstruction. Of course, my first thought of that sort of, Disneyfication of an archaeological site, I think of Knossos in Crete, sort of around the turn of the century in 1900 or so. They're excavating, the King Minos's palace, quote unquote, and just doing some reconstructions, just building things and painting things and sort of just making some really interesting choices with that. It's interesting to be at a historic site that's been a historic site for so long. We are farther away from the building of the park than the building of the park was from the Revolution. So wow. It's interesting to see the layers of interpretation and memory that are sort of visible in the site. And definitely the reconstructed buildings are part of that. One of the most visible ones right next to the visitor center is called the guardhouse. There's some local lore about that saying, yes, this was where the prisoners were kept prior to the execution. Not true, as far as we can tell. There may have been something built there. We're not totally sure what. Unfortunately, the archaeological context has been much disturbed by building and rebuilding that site. But even though it is not quite the right size or layout, it does give people an idea of how big the huts were. And I do like to have people walk in there and notice the bunk beds and sort of notice how tight a squeeze of it is just to stand in there. So I think that's a really helpful visual aid. We also have the quote-unquote officers' quarters that was built over what we now think is the magazine. And there's also, there was another officers' quarter building that was built across from where the museum is now. And that was unfortunately burned down in the 1970s, allegedly by some youths who were partying and perhaps did not realize that the chimney is fake. So,
so they put a fire.
Yeah.
No.
So very unfortunate, but it would be interesting, I think, to reconstruct one of the huts sort of in the 18th century style, much like how Lake Champlain Maritime Museum built the Philadelphia 2 in this, historically accurate manner, using, period tools, using horses to move the wood, things of that nature. But before that, we do want to work on restoring the guardhouse, which is in quite a sorry state. That offers sort of its own challenge because it's not very historically accurate to the Revolutionary War, but it is itself a historic structure at this point. So
right,
it has its own history within the park. Yeah, so we had a really interesting conversation with some circuit riders from Preservation Connecticut about that, talked about what we might do with it, and are currently looking for materials and funding to get that going.
Yeah, that is a really interesting aspect of all of this. It's just a really good segue, I think, to talk about some of the actual archaeology that has been done at the park. And if we could talk a little bit about what that's been able to tell us about the park that's maybe different than the way that it was reconstructed or what people thought about it, and also how people doing archaeology have kind of contended with the issue of doing not just the archaeology of the Revolutionary War period, but also the archaeology of the park and the Reconstruction period to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the sort of the first phase of archaeology at the park is, not really archaeology. It's sort of an antiquarian sort of project, right? So when they're building and landscaping the park, they are picking a lot of stuff just up off the ground that has been left behind by soldiers and is in relatively decent condition because all the trees have been cut down. There's no leaf litter. There's not a lot of dirt formation happening. So there are a number of, musket balls, horseshoes, spoons, pencils, shoe buckles, and of course, my very favorite thing, the flute made out of a gun barrel. Definitely top-notch, really speaks to the boredom involved in a winter encampment if you have flute-making gun barrel time on your hands. That fills up most of one of the cases that we have in the museum. Museum was built in 1921, by the way. It was built to be the museum. It is modeled after Washington's headquarters in Newburgh, so it looks a fair bit older from the outside, but it is relatively new, 104-year-old, looking good. building that was created when the original museum, which was the upper story of the pavilion, when the collection outgrew that small space and needed a bigger home. So following the sort of antiquarian phase, there's some more archaeology done in the 1970s, and that is under Dave Poirier. So there had been archaeology done at Valley Forge and at Morristown, those winter encampment sites. Those things were sometimes done a bit haphazardly, as he outlined in his paper about it. So he had a number of questions that could be answered by a more scientific excavation of Putnam Memorial State Park. And he was mostly interested in logistics, what archaeology could tell him about the logistics of a winter encampment. And I think he drew a number of conclusions based on what he found. Some interesting things. Sarah, you sent me his paper. I had not previously had access to it. If the park has it, it's buried in a moldy ancient folder, and I've never seen it. Yeah. So it was really interesting to read and find that one of the things we found recently had been identified in those projects in the 1970s. So yeah, one of those things I found really interesting. I mentioned earlier, saying that the nutritional deficiencies were worse here than at Valley Forge. And I'm also interested that he identified this lead casting area. I would really like to look at that more, look at his notes from that, because I don't know if he knew this. I know that Dan Cruson did not know this, but I know from my reading of women at winter encampments that casting musket balls from pouring lead into molds was often a job that women were assigned. So I would interpret that as an area that the women of the encampment were working in, and would be really interested in seeing what else could be recovered from that spot.
So that's the thing that we haven't talked about at all. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I know that you're interested in. Mm-hmm. Is the idea of camp followers and people who aren't mm-hmm. soldiers who are involved in these encampments, family members, wives, children, other people. Mm-hmm. Do we have any documentary evidence of those people being there as well, or how many there may have been associated with this encampment at the park?
We don't know how many. We do know that there were at least 8 marriages that took place during that winter between local people and soldiers. And we know that at least one person was treated for pregnancy at the military hospital in Danbury. We don't have a great idea of how many women there were. For scale, we know that at Valley Forge's encampment, there were about 14,000 soldiers and about 400 women. So, however, we also have reports from British intelligence who were describing the army and saying that the civilian attachment was bigger than the army itself at some spots. So,
wow.
Yeah, we're not quite sure. They didn't keep great records, partially because George Washington was very down on camp followers. They were frowned upon in the British Army, and he had been trained by them. Very much wanted to model his army on the British standard, and so was very, anti soldiers having their wives. Although, he was allowed to have his. Rank has its privileges. As Scott said. Different rule.
As I'm thinking about the camp followers, how mm-hmm. far is this encampment would it have been to the center of town, or where there was stores and taverns and churches, and are they kind of out in the wilderness, or are they close enough to town that that's a real option for people?
Yeah, they are kind of close enough to town. So the encampments Reading still today is sort of siloed off into different neighborhoods. You have Reading Ridge, which is, like a totally different world, seems like sometimes, than West Reading. And it was the same at the time, and there were political divisions going along with that. So one encampment was right mixed in where most of the, quote-unquote patriots lived, in West Reading, and the farther north encampment, what's now Putnam Memorial State Park, is smack dab at the end of primarily Tory settlement. So not far down the road from Putnam Memorial State Park is the Christ Church, the Episcopal Church that's been there since, before the Revolution. And so that area was heavily Anglican and therefore largely supportive of the British. They received monetary support, or the church did, at least, from the British Crown, being a Church of England establishment. And there were a lot of financial ties to the Church of England. They were fairly close. I couldn't tell you how long it would take to walk or ride horse to town, but if you're familiar with the area, it's not a huge stretch, not a huge distance between the older homes along Reading Ridge and the encampment. In fact, it's frequently a problem with civilians from town sort of coming in and just bothering people. Apparently, they were like, "Wow, this is a real security issue. These people could be spies. We'd have no idea." Kind of a major issue.
So they're close enough to town, but it's a town with a very Tory leaning. Is guess what you kind of just told us?
Yeah,
which has to be a problem in and of itself.
Yeah, so there's, I think that's why they assumed that some of them might be spies, and some of them may have been. I was just recently reading more about the Battle of Ridgefield and learned that on Tryon's march up to Danbury, he did stop and have breakfast with a Tory in Reading. And that makes sense to me. They went right up Reading Ridge. So that's very interesting, And the other encampments were, more in rebel/patriot territory. So probably a different experience for the soldiers of the Connecticut regiments who were down there.
Yeah, I think it also may highlight the fact that, just on face value, I think, this far away from the Revolutionary War, most of us just think everybody was in favor of, the rebellion, so to speak.
Right, yeah. And it's, maybe, there's 3 broad camps, there's about a third of people who are broadly supportive of breaking away, about a third that are broadly supportive of England, and a third who are just not really, super decided on either side. But I will say that there was a big sea change in Connecticut's attitudes in this matter by 1777. So the town of Ridgefield had originally had a town meeting and declared support for the crown, I believe in 75 or 6. But before the raid on Danbury and the Battle of Ridgefield, they had adopted a resolution planning to pay a certain amount to anyone who joined the Continental Army. So their thoughts on that had already shifted. And then during the attack on Danbury and the Battle of Ridgefield, that was just a huge watershed moment for many people in Connecticut who, to that point, had not really been affected by the war. There had not really been battles in Connecticut, especially inland, unlike in Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, which had all seen a certain amount of action. Connecticut had not. And I think it was maybe alarming. I mean, maybe not for the guy who took breakfast with General Tryon, but probably alarming for a lot of people to have the British Army just sort of march through quite suddenly. And I think that really spiked enlistment in Connecticut and really sort of turned Connecticut towards a more Continental Army leaning in their support. But going back to camp followers. So initially, when I started working at the museum, there was maybe one mention of women at the encampment, which was a description of what life in the encampment was like, just a paragraph about how bad the huts were and how crowded, all of that. And then it said there were also camp followers present. And that was really it. I think there's a perception that camp followers were all sex workers. And now, listen, I don't want to denigrate sex work. It's, I'm an archaeologist. It's an old profession, However, the Continental Army is very broke. So the women who are there are not really getting paid to be there. And in fact, they're doing a lot of really difficult and necessary labor for the Army that today might be done by civilian support services, but at that time was just done by women who did not get paid. They might eventually be able to receive pensions if they were married to soldiers, but they never really received recognition for their work. They were quite looked down on a lot of the time. They weren't guaranteed food necessarily unless they were on the strength of the regiment, as they say. But they provided critical support like nursing, laundry services, baking, cooking, textile, mending, a huge number of services that without which the Army simply would perish. So I do get very animated about it. I just think it's a really critical aspect of the logistics of wartime that just is not really looked at except for, a few, much mythologized, valorized cases like Molly Pitcher, for instance.
Right. So now, do you have a sense from some of the work that's been done in other places of what an archaeological signature might be for camp followers? Do we have a sense of what we would be looking for?
That's something that I've been trying to figure out. I will say I mentioned the casting of lead, lead into molds, the sort of smatterings of lead that are left by that and other markers of that activity. To me, I read that as a signature of camp followers working in that area, just because we know it was very commonly something women were assigned to do by what's been written about at Valley Forge, for instance. But research for me is still ongoing with that. So I've been reading Following the Drum, which is a book written about the women of Valley Forge. So I'm trying to figure out more about those activities. There's also a great book about camp followers called Belonging to the Army, about camp followers in the Revolutionary War specifically. Same author who wrote the Congress's own book, by the way. So I've also been reading that and trying to compile a list of activities that women typically tended to do. And I hope to eventually sort of write more about how to identify, what might have been women's activities in winter encampments. I'm a long way off from that because there's a lot we don't know, but, I'm looking forward to, trying to find out more about it.
Yeah, and I hope that we can help with that and, get out there and do some survey work with you. So it's a really interesting topic, and I think it deserves a lot of research, definitely understudied and definitely timely with the 250th coming up.
Can I just say a word or two about Dan Cruson?
Definitely.
Awesome. Okay. He is so critical to the history of the park, the history of interpreting the park. So I really want to mention him. Dan Cruson was Newtown's town historian. He was also a teacher at Joel Barlow, and he was a huge part of the archaeological and historical research that has been done here. He literally wrote the book about Putnam Memorial State Park, its history as a winter encampment and as a park. It's a lovely read, highly recommend it. Some of the things he found out were, one huge one, recognizing that the Revolutionary War cemetery was not a cemetery. It was, in fact, officers' quarters. And so all the things I've said about Henry Dearborn's lodgings, everything we know about that is because of Dan Cruzan doing digs in the late 1990s and early 2000s. A lot of what we know about, for instance, the officers' quarters, later determined to be a magazine, is from Dan Cruzan as well. He also did some really meticulous work measuring the bone scatter that helped establish like the exact dimensions of the huts, especially in relation to the fireplaces. So just some really critical work that he did really helped spark a revitalization of interest in the park. The park was closed for a time in the 90s. It was shut down by the state of Connecticut, and there was a group of local people who got together to just keep it running, like cutting the grass, for instance, and, just sort of keeping it from falling into ruin and agitating for the state to open and fund it once again. And Dan Cruzan was a huge part of that, sort of proving that it had this archaeological value to it. Of course, there was a 1990 survey from Boston University that helped with that as well. And yeah, I just would be really remiss not to mention Dan Cruzan when talking about the history of the park. In terms
absolutely.
I recently acquired from his son, Ben, who is now the new Newtown town historian, acquired a few boxes of Dan's notes. So I'm really looking forward to getting into those and cataloging them for us to use in our research.
Share with us the 3 things you wish the average Connecticut visitor or resident would know about this site. And also, can we go around the virtual roundtable and make sure people know how to contact each other?
3 things I wish people would know about the park. Great question. Now, I think the first one is that it is a state archaeological preserve. So if you do unauthorized metal detecting, you will be fined $5,000, and the museum mannequin will start appearing in your windows at night. I hear that's what I'm told.
You don't want
that. Of course, the metal detecting that we did, you don't want that. If you've seen the museum mannequin, you know you don't want that at all. Yes. Avoid visits from William. Now, the metal detecting that we did, authorized, totally cool, will not lead to hauntings. Let's see. Another thing, I wish people had a better idea of how diverse and integrated the Army was, because in addition to Black regiments and Native regiments like the Suffrage Regiment, Connecticut regiments were integrated. And there were many Native American soldiers as well in Connecticut regiments and in the New Hampshire and Canadian ones, I believe. So we've looked at a few, specifically Abimelech Uncas, who was a Mohegan soldier, Jabez Pottage, who was may have been Nipmuc or Pequot, or possibly both. Hard to tell, especially post-Treaty of Hartford. But those are just 2 Native soldiers who had really incredible service records, one of whom eventually became a prison ship martyr, the other of whom lived to a very old age and served for the entire war and survived the Stockbridge massacre and ended up being part of the Connecticut's 1st Cavalry, the Sheldon's Continental Light Dragoons. So just some really amazing stories there. There's also Cuff Wells, who was an enslaved West African who was really skilled with medicine, and after being at the park for a short time at the encampment, was seconded to the military hospital in Danbury and ended up staying there for the rest of the war. They called him Dr. Cuff, a very well-respected guy who, earned his freedom through participating in the Revolutionary War. And all told, from the Forgotten Voices of the American Revolution National Park Service project that I helped work on a few years ago. I believe they identified of the 3,000 that there are maybe 200 or so people of color at the Reading encampments. So I think it's, in addition to the women that are there, it's just a much more diverse picture than I think people assume. Certainly than I assumed when I first got there in 2018. And so I'm definitely hoping to raise awareness of that and push forward into more research about that.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really important story.
Absolutely, yeah. It's I take great pleasure in telling them at the Winter Walk. We just had our annual Winter Walk on Saturday, so really enjoyed getting to tell some of those stories. Let's see. The last thing, there is a diary from Sergeant Major John Hawkins, who's in, is he in the Canadian Volunteers or in the New Hampshire regiments? Not important. He wrote about, in his diary, about the encampment, and he did provide the best description of it that we have. But he did not count how many officers' huts there were, so we don't have a great idea of that. The excuse he gave, I cannot blame him. He said, I did not trouble to count them, for I thought the labor greater than the curiosity. And that is, just a great excuse that anyone can use for free.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all this. Clearly, you could talk about this forever, but we have to wrap it up. Mm-hmm. So I'll say you can reach the Office of State Archaeology at osa.uconn.edu and through our Facebook page.
And you can reach FOSA online at fosa-ct.org, as well as our Facebook page. And Ellery, where can people get in touch with you?
You can go to putnampark.org. You can email us, friends@putnampark.org, or find us on Facebook as well.
Guys, thanks so much for being part of ICRV Radio. We appreciate you.
Thanks, Ellery.
Thank you so much.